Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar organized by Gonit Sora. Today we have with us Professor Geeta Venkataraman from Ambedkar University, Delhi. Before going into the talk, let me mention a few things. So please use the chat option to ask questions and feel free to ask questions, but use the chat option. After the talk is over, I'll put the questions to the speaker. So you can send the questions to either me or Manjil. And in case your connection is lost in between, you can use the Facebook live stream to watch the talk. Uh, I'll share the link in a while. And now let me introduce the speaker. Today we have with us Professor Geeta Venkataraman, who is at present Dean of Research and Consultancy, as well as Professor in the School of Liberal Studies at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. She did her BSc Honours in Mathematics at St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi with first rank. She then did an MA in Mathematics from the University of Oxford, from where she got her doctoral degree, DPhil, in 1993. Before joining Ambedkar University, Professor Venkataraman taught for a very long time at St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. Her research interests are in various aspects of finite group theory. Apart from her interest in group theory and related areas, she is deeply interested in popularizing mathematics, mathematics education, and issues related to women in mathematics. She has served on various national and international boards related to mathematics education and research, as well as on editorial boards of journals devoted to mathematics. She has published several important books and papers, out of which we mention one, Enumeration of Finite Groups, Cambridge Tracts in Mathematics 170. So it was published by Cambridge University Press in 2007 and co-authored with Simon Blackburn and Peter Neumann. And today she's going to talk about symmetry and groups. So over to you, Professor Venkataraman.
Thanks, Vishal, and thanks, Manjil. I'm really very, very pleased to be delivering this lecture for Gonit Sora. And from whatever I have seen of the website and by talking to Manjil and others, it's a very, very impressive effort. And it really, really gladdens me to see such efforts happening, and which are also concentrating at the local state level and the local region. I think that is extremely important because sometimes big cities tend to grab all the mathematical events and so on, and it's really nice to see something happening in another place. Today, my aim is to tell you that you cannot separate groups and symmetry. Okay, so that's the key thought that I want you to go away with, and so let me start with the. I have slides, and I might also use a digital board in between.
Are those charged?
Is there a problem? Vishal, can I continue?
Yes, please.
The slide is showing up okay? My screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start with an intuitive idea of what a symmetry is. So initially, and okay, by the way, I was also told that there may be high school students or undergrads who are part of this lecture. So I will try to make it self-contained. So if you don't know what a group is right now, don't worry too much. I will be taking people through some definitions and so on as well. But if you already know what groups are, you'll have to bear with me because I'm trying to make sure that this talk is accessible to all the people attending it. And if you have a very urgent doubt about something that I'm saying, you can write in the chat box, and I'm sure Vishal or Manjil will stop me and ask me to explain something. And I noticed that that there's an eagle eye kept on the mistakes being made. So I also look forward to anything of that sort being pointed out.
Ma'am, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe you can make make it full screen.
Full screen. Okay. Um, yeah, is that all right?
Yes.
So in this slide, I've put certain pictures. Oh, okay. So sorry, if I put it on slideshow, it's just moving, changing on its own, I think. So I'll just change my view format. Just give me a minute because it'll run away before I can actually say what I want to say.
Right.
Technical glitches. Let me change this to single page and also change it to full screen. Yeah, this will be better, I think. Okay, so here's the page, and I put 1, 2, 3, 4 pictures up here. And the first one, I hope it reminds you of something. I'm not going to say what it should remind you of, but I will definitely tell you that the first picture on the left, it's by a very famous artist called M.C. Escher. And so here's your first question for you, which you can use the chat box and reply to, and we'll discuss this after the talk is over. So you should tell me what this thing reminds you of, this particular M.C. Escher picture that I've put. And of course, in the next picture, I have some three-dimensional objects. I'm not quite sure what they are actually. I seem to have picked them up and put them because they looked interesting. And below these two pictures is a line of smileys. And we'll be looking at something called strip patterns later. And just below that looks, I mean, you have to use your imagination, but it's called a wallpaper pattern. So these are some examples of the kinds of objects that I might be interested in. But before I go into that, what is symmetry? So how would you describe symmetry or define symmetry? Now, in general, if you ask people, when you show them two pictures and ask them which is more symmetrical, by and large they'll be able to tell you, even though they have no idea what mathematically a symmetry might mean. Intuitively, we seem to be able to register what we mean by one object being more symmetrical than the other. But first, as I've put in this slide, I want you to look at this intuitive idea of a symmetry. So suppose I'm in a classroom and I have a duster in front of me, and I ask everybody in the classroom to close their eyes, and in the meantime I do something to the duster and I ask them to open their eyes again. And when the class reopens, they open their eyes again, they see that nothing has happened to the duster. The duster is, occupying the same space and looking exactly like it did before. But I have actually done something to the duster. Okay, so I've moved it in a particular way, but that particular way of moving it has brought it back to occupying the exact same space and looking exactly like it did before. So intuitively, we can think about a symmetry of a figure as an action that you can perform on the figure, such that if someone has closed their eyes during that performance, they feel as though nothing has happened. Okay? So in other words, it's occupying the exact same place and it looks like it has not been touched. To reinforce this further, suppose you have a cutout of an equilateral triangle with you. You put it on your notebook and draw its outline. Okay? And then I ask you to do various things with that cutout such that it comes back and occupies that outline. Okay? So the question is, what are the things that you can do to the cutout? You're not allowed to tear it. You have to keep the cutout as it is. And can you describe precisely the actions that you can do on this cutout so that it comes back and occupies that outline which you have drawn in the on your notebook? Okay, and in fact, you'll see that. Okay, maybe I should use this. Yeah. Okay. So here I've put down all the things that you can do to an equilateral triangle to which will bring that cutout back into the outline. And this is something that you can try out really easily yourself. You'll see that if you poke a pencil through the center of the triangle, okay, which is the point at which the altitudes or the medians meet, and then you try and rotate the cutout that you have, you'll find that it comes, maybe we use an anti-clockwise direction of rotation, and you will find that only when you have rotated it 120 degrees or 240 degrees, or you've not rotated it at all or done a 360 degree, will you come back to the outline. And so what we can say is that there are 3 rotational symmetries that a triangle, equilateral triangle has, which is 0 degrees, 120 degree rotation, and a 240 degree rotation. At the same time, if you fold the cutout along lines drawn on the cutout, then you will see that if you fold along a median or an altitude, then the 2 parts will match. They will overlap exactly with each other. All such lines are called lines of reflection. And you can physically think of the reflection as lifting the cutout of the equilateral triangle, turning it and putting it back. Okay. I mean, I should have explained that when we are dealing with planar figures, when I mean by the action of the figure, it has to happen within the 2 dimensions. Okay. But you can think of a reflection as picking up the that cutout and then turning it over and putting it down. Okay. So that would give you the same effect as a reflection that is done. So it's for you to check that there are only 3 rotations and 3 reflections that are possible for an equilateral triangle. In fact, it's also true that if I take any finite planar figure, so what do I mean by a finite planar figure? By finite, I just mean that if I can draw, if I draw it on my notebook, I can put a rectangle around it. So it has finite area, basically. Okay? So if I take a finite planar figure, you can actually, in fact, prove that it has only 2 types of symmetries. One is what is called a reflection and the other is a rotation. And the reflection for these things will be about a line. So the other way of thinking about a reflection is if you put a mirror on the line, then you will actually see the entire image of that object is what you will be seeing in the mirror. Okay? And so when you talk about a reflection, it is about a line. And when we talk about a rotation, it is about a point. And the axis of rotation in planar things will be perpendicular to the plane of the object. Okay? And I'll leave you to think about what happens if you have an isosceles triangle which is not equilateral. What happens if you have a scalene triangle which is neither isosceles. I mean, it's scalene triangle anyway means unequal 3 sides. So what happens to its symmetries? Similarly, you can also look at 4-sided figures. So you can look at the square, a rectangle which is not a square, rhombus, parallelogram, and all these objects, and you can try and think what are all the possible symmetries. And in general, we are going to be interested in what is called the regular n-gon. Okay, so the square is the regular 4-gon, equilateral triangle is your regular 3-gon, And when we are talking about a regular n-gon, all its sides have equal length and the interior angles are all the same. So you can again try and think what will be the interior angles of a regular n-gon. But so the point to remember is that if I have a finite planar figure, it's only going to have two types of symmetries, reflections and rotations. But there are also figures which do not have any reflections. Okay? And here I've given you two pictures, and you can see the three legs. It's actually part of a flag of a particular, I was told Isle of Man has this thing in its flag. But you can kind of see that there is an equilateral triangle involved here. Okay? And then you kind of spoiled the equilateral triangle by adding these three legs to it. And the moment you've added these three legs in this manner, you've done it such that your rotations are preserved still, but your reflections no longer hold. And in fact, you can do this to any regular n-gon. If you take a regular n-gon, you'll find that it has n lines of reflection, the diagonals essentially, and it will have n rotations that are possible. And you can tweak your regular n-gon in such a way that the new figure that you create will end up having just n rotations and no reflections. So these are examples of that. And indeed, it's true that if you take a finite planar figure and it has only finitely many symmetries, then only one of two things can happen. Either it has exactly n rotations and n reflections, or it has just rotations. You can never have a planar object in which the number, if it has reflections and there are only finitely many of these, then the number of reflections and number of rotations have to match. And this looks like a theorem in mathematics, literally, right? I mean, because you're kind of saying that, you know, whatever figure I draw on my piece of paper, as long as it has only finitely many symmetries, then here's a really nice thing. Either there'll be equal number of reflections and rotations or just rotations. Okay, nothing else is possible. So I cannot draw a figure on paper which will have exactly 2 reflections and 3 rotations. It's not possible. Okay, and we'll see as the talk proceeds, you know, how we would even want to get to proving something like that. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Okay, here I just wanted to very briefly tell you that, of course, you also have planar figures which are not finite. Okay, so here is what is called a strip pattern. So you have to use your imagination and assume that it is continuing both on the left and right. And all of you are familiar with the number line. So you just think of a motif. Here it's a smiley, which is being stamped at all integer points. Okay, and what you have as a result is a strip pattern. And you can, the definition of the symmetry is still the same. What are the things that you can do to the strip pattern such that if somebody closed their eyes, they wouldn't know that you've done something. Okay? But because this is a strip pattern which stretches on both sides, left and right, infinitely, you can find reflections. Of course, here I've marked some reflections, and there are sort of 2 types of lines of reflection here. But there is something else that you can do, which is called a translation, right? So I can think of this infinite strip pattern that you have, and you move the strip pattern to the right exactly 1 unit. What is that 1 unit? It's the space between the center of 2 smileys. Okay, and that I'll call as a translation. So this is not, in fact, the formal definition of a finite figure is it has no translation. But that is a different approach. We are doing it differently here. And in this strip pattern, you'll see that it has reflections about between two smileys. I can have a line of reflection. I can have a line of reflection going through the smiley, and there are translations that are possible. Okay? And a strip pattern will always have translation symmetry. It may or may not have the following types of symmetries: reflections about vertical lines, reflections about horizontal lines, and non-zero degree rotations. Now, non-zero degree rotation that can happen in this kind of a strip pattern at most is 180 degree rotation. But it may or may not happen. And in this example that I've given you here, it has all these things. Okay? And then you can ask, are these the only types of symmetries that a strip pattern can have? Is there anything more that can happen? And what you do realize is, yes, in fact, if you think about it a little bit, a symmetry followed by another symmetry is again going to be a symmetry, right? Because it's an action that I do, which if someone closes their eyes, they cannot figure out I've done it. So if I take that equilateral triangle and the cutout and I do a 120 degree rotation, and then I reflect about one of the altitudes, the net result is that that equilateral triangle is again going to occupy the same space and the outline that I have drawn. So a symmetry followed by a symmetry is again a symmetry. Okay, so but in a strip pattern, you can have reflection as well as translation. So what happens if I reflect and then translate? Of course, in a strip pattern, the translation is only happening horizontally. And the example that I've given here is sort of looking at it in a more general way on a plane. Okay? So suppose I have the letter R and I reflect it first, and then I translate it as shown in the first figure here. Then obviously, so you have to imagine that this is all happening to the plane itself. So I've reflected the plane and then I've translated the plane, and I'm using the letter R to see what's happening to where will it end up when I've done this thing to the whole plane. So the R, which started out in the leftmost point, has ended up being reflected and pushed to the rightmost bottom corner there. And this has to be a symmetry, because the two things that I've done are reflection and translation, which are symmetries of my plane. So this again has to be a symmetry. But what you find is that your reflections, rotations, and translations are not enough to explain this new symmetry that you got. And this symmetry, therefore, has a special name. It's called a glide reflection. But the glide reflection is what you get if you apply a reflection followed by a translation, or vice versa of the plane. Okay? But the way we represent the glide reflection is by saying that, because we want to count it as a single symmetry, is that we'll say that a glide reflection happens. It's a symmetry where you have a mirror reflection followed by a translation, but the translation has to be in the same direction parallel to that of the reflection. Okay? And this thing is described in the picture below. And in fact, if you think a little bit, you can rewrite this picture or redraw this picture which I have given on top using a glide reflection. Okay, so you just have to move your line of reflection someplace to a little bit more to the right, and then you have to, so that your reflected R just comes vertically on top of the reflected R at the bottom right hand corner. Once you do that, that net effect is what is described by a glide reflection. So strip patterns have translations. They may or may not have reflections about vertical lines, horizontal lines, may or may not have non-zero degree of rotation, and they may or may not have glide reflections. Okay, so but these are the only types of symmetries that can occur for a strip pattern. And when you look at a wallpaper pattern, the way I think about wallpaper patterns are they are strip patterns, the same strip pattern, but now I also put them one on top of the other with some spacing or with no spacing, but the spacing in the vertical direction also is equal. Okay, and so the strip pattern continued on the left and right infinitely, and the wallpaper pattern will continue on the left and right as well as the top and bottom infinitely. And typically a wallpaper pattern will have translations in two independent directions, and it may or may not have reflections about horizontal lines, vertical lines. Here you can also have oblique lines, and it may or may not have non-zero degree rotations. It may or may not have glide reflections. So you have to examine these wallpaper patterns and see which of these they have. And in this talk, I'm not going into it, but you can actually classify the different types of strip patterns, and you can similarly classify the different types of wallpaper patterns. So there are 7 types of strip patterns, and that is every strip pattern that you have will be one of these only. And similarly, there are 17 different types of wallpaper patterns. And it's believed that, Alhambra, which is this Moorish palace which was built in Spain many, many centuries ago, has window lattices. So these are decorations like grills on the window, which basically, in fact, all the 17 wallpaper patterns you're supposed to be able to find there. So these were made by artisans who had no clue about symmetry or wallpaper patterns, but somehow in the manner in which they have created that, it's actually all the 17 can be found there. So what's a formal definition of symmetry? I've given you an intuitive idea, and that has allowed us to see all of these things. So I'm now going to, yeah, sure.
So Sunita Majhi asks, how many symmetries exist in a rectangle?
So if you take a rectangle which is not a square, Sunita, you have to think about what can be your lines of reflection. So a line of reflection is you draw it on your rectangle cutout and then you fold it, and both parts should match. So if you think a little bit about it, there are only 2 lines of reflection for a rectangle. One is so you have the long sides in a rectangle and the short sides. So if you join the midpoint of opposite sides, those will be your 2 lines of reflection. Okay, so you have 2 reflection symmetries. And again, if you think a little bit, any rotation that you do, the long side has to come back to the long side and the short sides have to come back to the short sides. So the only rotation that will be possible in a rectangle other than 0 degrees, which is also called do nothing, is your 180 degree rotation. So you'll have 2 rotations and 2 reflections when you're looking at symmetries of a rectangle. Is anything else, Vishal? Otherwise, I will continue.
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, so now how do you, formally, of course, it's a maths talk, and I have to tell you formally what a symmetry is. So, I mean, if you're not very familiar with Rn as a coordinate space, I mean, you can think of it as the collection of all n tuples where the entries are from real numbers. Okay. So in R square, basically these are points on a plane. Okay, so you used to in school drawing the x and y axis, and for any point on that coordinate plane, you have the x coordinate and you have the y coordinate. And there's a concept of distance between 2 points. Okay. So if I draw 2 points, if I have 2 points on the coordinate plane, the line joining them gives you the distance. Of course, if I have only one copy of R, that is our number line, our real line. And then if I pick 2 points there, it's basically if I take 2 points on the real line, say A and B, then the distance between A and B is given by mod of A minus B. And similarly, you have the distance formula that you learn for the distance between any 2 points on a coordinate plane. And similarly, you have the distance between any 2 points in when you're in 3-dimensional space. And this can in fact be generalized to higher dimensions. So the point that you have to remember is that Rn, between any 2 points in Rn, and in your mind just keep R square in mind, which is our plane. So between any 2 points in Rn, there is this concept of a distance between 2 points. When I say a figure X is a subset of Rn, so think that I drew an outline of the equilateral triangle. So the border as well as all the points in the equilateral triangle, that's my figure X. Okay, and it's a subset of the plane. So similarly, I might have a cube which is sitting inside R cubed, and that is a figure that I might be interested in. Or I might be interested in this cup which I'm holding, which is a 3-dimensional object, and this is an object X which is occupying certain coordinates in my 3-dimensional space. And so I might be interested in the symmetries of the cup. Okay? So in general, when I want to talk about a symmetry, I need 2 things. I need a figure X, or basically it's a collection of coordinates, and it's a subset of my Rn. And the point to remember is things in Rn, between 2 things in Rn, I can talk about distance. 2 points in Rn, I can talk about distance. So what is the symmetry of X? It is a bijective function from X to X. Okay, so I'm not going into the definition of a function at a bijective function, but in a way what this really means is that if I take 2 copies of X, and to each point there is a unique point on the other copy of X that I can map it to, and this gives me a 2-way direction. So from one copy of X, I can think of this line joining these 2 points, which point in the first copy of X, which is mapped to the point in the second copy of X. I can travel it and then I can come back. So it's a way of matching 2 copies of X. That's the way you have to think about your bijective function. And but what I want also is an additional condition. I want that these bijective functions should preserve distance. Now, what do I mean by this? Let's come back to our equilateral triangle. And we know that if I call the vertices as A, B, and C, then the length of AB is the same as the length of AC is the same as the length of BC, right? And suppose X is my equilateral triangle and I want to find the symmetries of X, then I'm looking for a bijective function from the equilateral triangle to itself such that it's going to preserve distances, which means that if I take the vertex A, then under this bijective function which preserves distances, if you think just for a little bit, you'll see that it can only get mapped to the other vertices. So either A stays where it is, or it can go to B, or it can go to C when you apply a symmetry. Okay? But in general, this preserving of distance also means that, frankly, you're not supposed to tear your equilateral triangle. You have to do your action in such a way that the entire equilateral triangle, something is done to it in its entirety. But and for those who are familiar with this, you don't even need to stick to Rn. You can take a metric space with a distance on it, and then our symmetries are nothing but bijective functions on X. X is a subset of your metric space. symmetries are bijective functions which preserve distance. Okay? Now, if you look at the set of all possible symmetries of any such figure X, then you'll pretty soon see these 4 things that I've written down are true for it. I've already told you that a symmetry followed by a symmetry is again a symmetry. That means if I apply the rotation of an equilateral triangle and follow it by a reflection, the net result will again be, and you can check this. So if I do a rotation first and then follow it by a reflection in an equilateral triangle, then I will get another reflection. Okay, just check this out. And associativity, it's like associativity of numbers that you're used to. You know, when you add 3 numbers, instead of think of R, S, and T as your numbers and this composition to be your addition. Then this is nothing but your familiar associative property of addition that you learned for either your natural numbers. And of course, you can also think of that for your integers. Existence of identity, you can obviously, if you do the do nothing symmetry first and then follow it by a symmetry, you'll again get that symmetry on. Yeah? And it doesn't matter in which direction you do it. And the most important thing is for every symmetry, there is this other symmetry which we'll call as the inverse. And what happens is if you apply one after the other in whichever direction, you'll get back to the do nothing symmetry. That is, your object is exactly the way it is. I should mention, you know, I mean, if you, I've told you, if you close your eyes, you don't know I've done anything. Then how do you keep track of symmetries? And so the way you keep track of symmetries is that if you have an equilateral triangle, you basically see where the vertices go. So if I do a 120-degree rotation in an anti-clockwise direction and I've marked the vertices A, B, C in an anti-clockwise way, if I do a 120-degree rotation, A will move to B, B will move to C, and C will move to A. If I do a reflection about the altitude starting from A and going to the opposite side of the 2 midpoints, then I'll see that A remains where it is and B and C get interchanged. Okay, so you usually track the symmetries by identifying certain important points on the figure in such a way that every symmetry is determined by what it does to those points. All right. So if I look at the 120-degree rotation in an equilateral triangle, its inverse will be the 240-degree rotation. And if you look at the reflection, any reflection is its own inverse, because if you do a reflection twice, you'll just get back to the original position. Okay? So we see that this is a closed system. There's closure, there's associativity, there's existence of identity, and there is existence of inverses. And if such a thing happens, then we say that the collection forms a group. And again, to be even more precise, I'm taking a non-empty set in Rm, subset in Rm, and SymX I'm defining to be the collection of all bijective functions on F such that F preserves distance. And then
there are a few questions.
Yeah.
So Chhatrapal Singh asks, is there any symmetry of rectangle about diagonal?
So I'm going to tell Chhatrapal, take a rectangle cutout. Okay, ask him to make a rectangle, not a square. Draw the diagonal, and he can, if he's at home, he can do this very quickly. Draw the diagonal and ask him to fold along the diagonal. And then Chhatrapal can see whether the 2 parts match. If they match, then he's not drawn a rectangle which is not a square. Okay, they will not match. So it will not be a line of reflection. Any other question?
Yes. So there's a question by Mithun Goswami.
Yeah.
Is there any relation between the sides of a polygon or the angles and line of symmetry?
Yes, there is. So let's take a square. And here we find there are 4 lines of symmetry. The midpoints of opposite sides. So that will give us 2 lines of symmetry and the 2 diagonals. Right? if I take, so typically the lines of symmetry in a regular n1, there'll be n lines of symmetry. And depending on whether you have even number of sides or odd number of sides, so if you have even number of sides, then you have n by 2 of them which will be coming from joining midpoints of opposite sides, and the other n by 2 will come from joining the diagonals, like in the case of a square or a hexagon or an octagon. And if n is odd, then I'll allow the listeners to decide, what are the actual things. Can you talk about lines of symmetry which are going to be joining midpoints of opposite sides at all or not? So that's another, I'm throwing back the question and asking them to think, rather than the answer, of course, is if you have a regular n1, there will be n lines of reflection.
So another question that I'll ask is, so this is from Prashant. For 3D objects, is there any interesting symmetry other than reflection, rotation, and glide rotation?
Glide rotation, glide reflection. See, for a 3-dimensional object, first of all, you'll pretty soon realize that symmetry, the size of this symmex. Okay, so I'm just coming to it, that this collection of all symmetries of any object forms a group. Okay, and it's called the group of symmetries of X. Now, when you look at 3-dimensional figures, in a way, I mean, or in any dimension, the largeness of symmex is kind of telling you that your object is more symmetrical. So the larger the group of symmetries is a measure of how symmetrical your object is. In 3 dimensions, in 2 dimensions, we have regular n-gons for all possible n's. But when you come to 3 dimensions, there are only 5 platonic solids. Right? And when you look at these platonic solids, again, you're only basically looking at reflections and rotations. There are no translations are possible when you have a finite figure in a 3-dimensional space. Okay, that is, if I can put the object into a cube or a cuboid, then it's a finite figure. And other than, and you'll find that again, there are only reflections and rotations. You can't have translations. And when you don't have translations, you can't get your glide reflections as such. And, but there is an interesting reflection that happens. In 2-dimensional things, we are looking at reflection about a line. But in 3 dimensions, you can also kind of look at reflection about a point. And that brings in some additional things. And one of the interesting things which is done typically in either undergrad or postgrad courses is, find all the groups of symmetry of the 5 platonic solids that you have. And, and I mean, another point is you shouldn't look at symmetry. There's a more general definition of symmetry also. I mean, in a way, it is whatever property that you assume of your object, you're kind of looking for bijective functions which preserve that property that you're assuming for your object. So in a way, once I talk about groups, I can also ask about what are the symmetries of a group. Okay, but a group is basically a non-empty set in which there is this very nice way of combining things. There's an operation which is closed, associative, there's existence of identity and inverses. So when I want to talk about symmetries of a group, then I'll be talking about what are the bijective functions of a group which preserve that group operation. So then I get to what is called an automorphism. On the other hand, if I just have a set with 3 objects, okay, nothing to, no distance between them, no nothing, it's just a set with 3 things in it, then I only want to know that the set is preserved. Okay, then when I talk about the symmetry of that set, I'm only asking what are the bijective functions on that set. Okay. On the other hand, if you're interested in in topology kind of things, and you're looking at symmetries of a topological object, then you will define, it's basically your bijective functions, but which preserve the topological invariance that you can think of. No? So the notion of symmetry is actually much more general than what I'm talking about here. And so to come back to the question that that person asked, in 3 dimensions, if you're looking at a finite object, basically you still only have reflections and rotations, but you have this interesting other reflection which is about a point, about the center of that object really. Okay. Vishal, can I continue, or
Yes, please.
any more questions?
There are a few, but we can take them at the end.
Okay. So I'm just going to sum up. So now I've given you a formal definition of what a symmetry is. I've told you that when you compose 2 symmetries, there's closure, there's associativity, there's existence of identity, and that of inverses. And if you have such a closed system with a good way of combining, which here is composition, then we call it a group. And so we have a group of symmetries for any figure X, which is sitting inside a space where there's a distance between 2 points in X. Okay, so let's sum up what we've learned for symmetry group of for planar figures. We've learned that if X is a regular n-gon, then sim X consists of n rotations and n reflections. And we denote this sim X by a special name. It's called Dn, or the dihedral group of degree n. And it has 2n symmetries. N of them are reflections and n of them are rotations. And I should mention that if your composition does not give you the same result if you change the order. So if I apply a 120-degree rotation of a equilateral triangle and then follow it up by a reflection about the altitude starting from A, the result is not the same if I do things the other way around. That is, if I first reflect about the altitude coming from A and then do a 120-degree rotation, I'll end up with a different reflection. So you say then that the symmetries don't commute. So the order in which you apply that symmetry then matters. Okay? And if the resulting group is then called non-abelian. If you can find at least 2 symmetries which don't commute with each other, then we'll call that particular symmetry group non-abelian. On the other hand, like if you take the symmetries of a rectangle, you'll find that it does not matter in which order you apply them. They will all give you, both directions will give you the same. And then that is called an abelian group. Okay. So it turns out that this dihedral group, so if you, from equilateral onwards, it turns out to be a non-abelian group, and it has 2n elements. And there are figures where, so when you have a rectangle, and this we've discussed before when I answered a question, there are exactly 2 rotations and 2 reflections. This forms an abelian group, and it's called the Klein's 4 group. And you can actually, I mean, this is for people who maybe understand a little bit more of group theory. But you can write down what is called the presentation for the dihedral group. And I'll try to explain what this means, but don't worry too much if you are not able to follow it precisely. So this dihedral group has n rotations and n reflections. And what this presentation is saying is you just need 2 of them to express all of them. Okay. So which 2 am I taking? I'm taking what is called the basic rotation. So think of, in a square, what are the rotations which work? There's a 90-degree rotation, 180-degree rotation, 270-degree rotation, and 0-degree rotation. So look at the rotation which has the smallest positive degree. That is the 90-degree rotation for a square. Okay. And what is 90? 90 is nothing but 2 pi by 4. 4 is the number of sides of a square, and 2 pi is the total angle in that when you do a complete rotation. All right. So if you take a regular n-gon, then you will find that the smallest degree for which the rotation works, positive degree, is 2 pi by n radians. So this rho is the rotation by 2 pi by n radians. And in a regular n-gon, if you mark the vertices in an anti-clockwise direction, say call it A1, A2, A3 up to AN, then you'll find that when you do this rotation rho, A1 will go to A2, A2 will go to A3, A3 will go to, so it goes in a cycle, you know. And if I apply rho twice, what will happen is A1 will go to A3, A3 will go to A5, and so on. Okay. So if you think about it just a little bit, you'll realize that if I apply rho, if I do nothing, I get the 0-degree rotation. If I apply rho once, I get basically rho. If I apply rho twice, then I've actually rotated the regular n-gon by an angle 2 pi by n plus 2 pi by n. Okay? And that gives me another, it's a different rotational symmetry, and that I'll call as rho square. And similarly, you can work out what is rho cube, rho to the 4, and so on, and you'll see rho n minus 1 when you do, basically A1 will get to AN then. Okay, so in a square, what will be this rho n minus 1? It will be the 90-degree rotation applied thrice. So it is the same as a 270-degree rotation. Okay, so you've got all your n rotations just via this rho. Okay, so rho alone applied enough number of times is giving you all the n rotations. So rho to the power 0 is your do nothing rotation. Then you have rho square all the way up to rho n minus 1. Then what it's saying is you pick any reflection that you like. A reflection applied twice gets you identity. So that's what that sigma is, your reflection. It's saying sigma square gives you identity. Rho is your rotation, and it says if you apply rho n times, you will get to identity. And what basically happens then is all the other reflections can be written as, you'll get all the n reflections as sigma rho. That is, you apply rho first and then sigma. Then you apply rho square first and then sigma, and so on. Apply rho to the power n minus 1 and then sigma, and that gives you the other n reflections that are there. This thing which this equation which is written here in the end is basically saying that if I apply sigma first and then rho and then again I apply sigma, the net result is the same as rho inverse. Okay? So typically this is called a presentation. These are called generators and these are called relations. And what it does is it just compresses the information about the group Dn for me. So if I understand what this means, I can unravel and write down all my elements. Of course, it's not always possible, but in this case, you will definitely be able to do it. Okay? So this is the presentation that we have for Dn. And another thing we've learned is that given any positive integer n, there are planar figures for whose symmetry groups consist only of n rotations. Okay, so think of your square or that equilateral triangle with legs drawn. Then that group of symmetries, it had only those 3 rotations: 0 degree, 120 degree, and 240 degree. And we'll call its symmetry group as C3. C is for cyclic. Cyclic just means that it's, like all the rotations of Dn could be written via that single element rho. That is enough to write down. So it's basically saying that there is one basic rotation which I can use to write down all the other rotations, and the group is then called Cn. And this is the theorem I mentioned to you, which we will prove in a little while. And I'm not even sure. I've like really run out of time, I think, in just this. But let me take you through what I plan to do. So we'll come to this result, which we can show, which says that there are equal number of if I take a finite planar figure which has only finitely many symmetries, then I have to have either equal number of reflections and rotations or only rotations. Okay, but how did groups originate? Did people recognize that these groups of symmetries were there, or what actually happened? I like to trace the origins of group theory through looking at equations. So this is something that all of you are familiar with, a quadratic equation, and the quadratic equation is ax square plus bx plus c equal to 0. And of course, the cartoon is the kind of problem that parents are facing these days when they have to help their children with a lot of their schoolwork. Many of them have forgotten what quadratic equations are or what the solutions are. But we are people who study maths, so I'm sure everybody remembers this formula. And I have to say that when I was in school, the day in fact, one of my cousins who was older than I had already learned the quadratic formula, and one summer vacation, she showed me how to complete squares and get hold of this formula, and it felt like a bit of magic that I had been exposed to. So, but what is there in this quadratic formula? You can see that in this equation, A, B, and C are the coefficients, and we've created this formula for the roots using only the coefficients. We are doing arithmetic on the coefficients, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and extraction of roots. So if you could solve an equation using, by writing the formula like this, then it was called solving by radicals. So quadratic equations, people knew thousands of years ago how to solve them, really. But I mean, in fact, more than 1,000 years ago. I think I can't even remember how far back it goes. You can find I mean, you can find instances of this coming up way in the past. And then obviously, as maths students, you should ask what happens to a cubic. Okay, so if you're given a cubic equation, how do you find its roots? In school, of course, you learn to factorize and so on. But the question I want to ask is, if I'm given a general cubic, that is an ax cube plus bx square plus cx plus d equal to 0, where a is non-zero, a, b, c, d are my real numbers, can I write down the equations, the three roots of a cubic equation? And the answer is yes. And that goes back to, it's actually a very, very intriguing story. I don't have the time to actually tell you the story, but I'm just throwing some names at you. All this happened in the 16th century. You have, in those days, if you were a mathematician or knew how to do a really good bit of mathematics, you could earn a lot of money. You had mathematical duels. So these were maths competitions where each side put up a whole set of problems and then you were expected to solve it. And it was a spectator sport. People came and watched you doing these things. So apparently the story goes that Scipione del Ferro knew how to solve one particular type of cubic equation, which was not difficult. And Tartaglia is someone who knew how to do it much better. And in the duel, finally Tartaglia wins, and he keeps this method of solving cubics secret. And but Cardano basically learns the solution from Tartaglia and he extends the solution, and he wants to publish it. But Tartaglia has taken a promise from him that he will not reveal his solution, Tartaglia's solution. So then he manages to get around it, and he and his student solve up to the quartic. Okay? So quadratic, cubic, quartic, all of these equations you can solve in general. You can write a formula for the roots using only the coefficients and extraction of roots on them. And then the question was that, can you do this for a fifth degree equation? Okay. And Lagrange is again another mathematician who investigates degree 4 things. And the beginnings of group theory are there, but not quite there. Then comes somebody called Rufidi, who thought that he managed to show that a fifth degree equation could not be solved by radicals, but there was a gap in his proof. Cauchy, however, thought quite highly about his proof. And then comes Abel, after whom your abelian groups are named. He's the first person who shows that if you take a general degree of equation, general equation of degree 5, you cannot write the roots of that equation by manipulating the coefficients and extracting roots, doing arithmetic and extracting roots. So you cannot solve it by radicals. But his proof was very, very limited. I mean, it was specific to degree 5. And Krell's journal, which is one of the oldest journals in mathematics, that's where Abel proves his result. Abelian groups are named after Abel. So the word abelian comes from Abel. And of course, now you have an Abel prize as well. And then one of my favorite mathematicians, Galois. So Galois is about the average age of the audience, I would think much lower than the average age of the audience. He's 19 years old, has never managed to get into the best institutions in France to study, but he does something which we do all the time in mathematics, which is that the questions are in, about equations. So I want to know, if I'm given a general equation of degree n, can I write down its roots by, can I solve that equation by radicals? Can I write down its roots by doing arithmetic on the roots and extraction of roots? And Galois, what he does is that he moves it from the realm of equations to group theory. So to each such equation, he's able to associate a group, which now we call Galois group. And he shows that you can solve that equation by radicals if and only if the Galois group satisfies a certain property called solvability. I'm not going to go into that, but basically at one fail swoop, he manages to show that for 5 upwards, you cannot solve a general equation of degree n by radicals. Okay, so that question gets settled. Of course, Galois' work is not understood by people. He dies when he's just 21 over a duel, and his work actually gets published much later. He also has sent his work to various famous mathematicians who managed to misplace it, lose it. All kinds of things happen to him. So in his personal life, in that sense, there are a lot of tragedies, but mathematically, we now have an entire area of mathematics named after him called Galois theory. And so these were Poisson, Liouville, Jordan are all people who tried to look at Galois' work and this thing. But Galois uses, see this particular thing that I put here, he has actually talked about composition. So he calls the element, the like for substitution basically means a kind of permutation, which is a symmetry when we are just looking at sets, not bothering about this concept of distance. Okay, so he's saying if in such a group, if one has substitutions S and T, then it also has the substitution ST, which means he's basically talking about closure. And we'll see later that when we're looking at what are called finite subgroups, we just need to check closure. But Galois has an understanding of what a group is. Of course, he's looking at very, very specific type of group there. And this is around 1832. And it's still not there. The form in which we study groups and axioms for groups comes much later. And these are all people who contributed: Cayley, Van Dyck, and Burnside. Van Dyck was Klein's PhD student. Klein was one of Klein's bottle you may have heard of. Klein is one of the few people who was actually interested in how to teach maths as well. He wrote a lot about that. But Van Dyke was probably the first person who gave the definition of what we might call an abstract group. Burnside then in 1897 actually wrote a book, but he still didn't use the concept of an abstract group. And this is something that I've picked from the web, and it kind of gives you how various bits of various people contributed to what we call the 20th century definition. And this is the definition that we have now. So we have a non-empty set and a binary operation. It's just a nice way of combining. The moment you have a binary operation, you already have closure. And then you need to have associativity, which is this first line here, existence of inverses, and identity. And when these things commute, we say it's abelian. And you can prove that in a group, identity and inverses are unique. And previously, what we have proved is, or shown is, or thought about is, that if you have X as a subset of Rn, then its set of symmetries is a group. So very quickly, what's a subgroup? A subgroup is basically a subset of a group under the same operation. And here, let me just throw a very quick example, which all of you are used to. You look at integers under addition, that's a group. Rational numbers under addition, that's a group. Real numbers under addition, a group again. Abelian, infinite abelian groups. These are all complex numbers under addition as well. When under multiplication, if you look at non-zero rationals or non-zero reals or non-zero complex numbers, they form a group. If you look at the nth roots of unity in the complex field, that again forms a group, and that's a finite cyclic group of order n. So groups come in, from various directions, and once you have a group, if you're trying to see whether if a subset of it, which is non-empty, also is a group under the same operation, then we call it a subgroup. And you can check very easily that the group itself and just the identity will always be subgroups. And if I say looked at the symmetries of a square, that we know is a group which has 8 elements. But if I look at only the 4 rotations, that forms a subgroup. And this is true in any regular n-gon. And this group of rotations, subgroup of rotations, is basically just your Cn. So in a way, I can say, that is, I can look at the subgroup 1 row square up to rho to the power n minus 1, that will form a subgroup, and that is my same as my Cn, which I was looking at when we talked about symmetries of figures. Yeah? To check whether something is a subgroup, you need to check closure, you need to check that the identity of the group is there, and that every element in H has its inverse again back in H. Right? And we've now seen many examples of finite, infinite groups, abelian, non-abelian groups. But before I proceed a little further, I need to talk about orders of elements. But here's a thing to think about. Will any finite planar figure always have only finitely many symmetries? And the answer, if you just think a bit, is no, because if you take a circle, you'll realize that any angle between 0 and 2 pi can give you a rotation of the circle. Any diameter can act as a line of reflection. So if you put together all the symmetries of a circle which forms a group, you're going to get an infinite group. Okay, and but one thing that you should always realize is that a reflection applied twice will give you identity. On the other hand, if I take the rotation rho that I talked about in a regular n-gon, I have to apply it n times before I come to identity. If, however, I take a translation of a strip pattern, how many ever times I apply it one after the other, I'm not going to reach identity. Okay, so these are things that we capture as order of an element. basically this a to the power n in terms of symmetry means apply the symmetry a n times one after the other. In group theoretic terms, it just means do a star, a star, a star, a n times. So we say that A has finite order if there's a positive integer n, such that if you do a times a times a times a n times, you will get to identity. And the least such positive integer is called the order of A. So your reflection in the previous slide has order 2. And if I take the rotation by 2 pi by n for a regular n-gon, that has order n. And if there's no such positive integer which works, then we say it has infinite order. So the translation that I gave you as an example previously has infinite order. Okay, so you can have, but of course in a finite group, you will only have elements of finite order. You cannot have an element of infinite order in a finite group. Finite group means it has only finitely many elements. Okay. Now, I want to very quickly take you to symmetries of a plane. You can, in fact, all our symmetries of regular n-gons, you can think of as symmetries of the plane, because I can put my regular n-gon, say, at the origin, and whatever I do to the regular n-gon, I do to the entire plane. Okay? So they're all just symmetries of the plane. Your symmetries of the regular n-gon then become subgroups of the big collection of symmetries that you have for a plane. And these are finite subgroups of your symmetries of the plane, which I'm calling group of symmetries, which I'm calling M. So definitely our regular n-gons, our Dn and Cn are finite subgroups of M. Are there any other finite subgroups of M? And the answer is no. If you have a finite subgroup of M, then it has to be either a Dn or a Cn. Now what I mean by either a Dn or a Cn is that there's a concept in groups called isomorphism. It basically means the group is essentially the same, it's just in disguise. Okay, so the finite subgroups of M are basically just Dn and Cn. But what are actually all the symmetries of a plane? How do we track them? A good way is to see what happens to the letter R. Okay, there are just 4 types of symmetries of the plane: reflection, rotation, translation, and glide reflection. And this is a very quick thing that I've drawn of what is happening in a reflection. So this is the line of reflection. It's not very straight. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at drawing straight lines. So the R has got reflected. Okay, you have to remember that the entire plane is getting reflected about that line. I'm just capturing it by seeing what is happening to the R. Here I have an anti-clockwise rotation by degree theta. This is a translation by a vector t, and this is a glide reflection where I've reflected and then translated in parallel direction. So these are the only 4 types of things that you have. Obviously, any line you take in the plane is going to give you a reflection of the plane. Okay, any point you take on the plane and do an angle of theta rotation, that gives you a rotation of the plane. Any vector that you take, it gives you a thing. So actually the collection of symmetries of the plane is huge. It's this huge big group, but of course we are very clever as group theorists, because when we have huge groups, infinite groups of that sort, what we then try and do is we classify them, or we classify what the elements in them will look like. And at the end, it actually turns out to be quite nice. You can talk about the motions of a plane or symmetries of a plane, and it turns out to be a composition of just 2 types of symmetries. Okay, but I'm not going into that in this talk. And so next, what we want to do is, as I said, we've looked at this already. And this is the theorem I want to quickly take you through. And what this result is saying is that if I start out with any finite planar figure, which has only finitely many symmetries, then it has exactly n rotations and n reflections, or just n rotations. Okay, so how do you show So what's our question? We have this huge big group of symmetries, which is symmetries of a plane. And we have this finite subgroup in it. And I want to show that this finite subgroup is essentially either the symmetries of a regular n-gon or the symmetries of an object which has only rotations in it and finitely many of them. So the first, and remember that if I just take a subset of M, which is a subgroup, it could have any type of symmetry in it, right? It could have a translation or a glide reflection or a rotation or a reflection. But because a translation and a glide reflection have infinite order, right? So that they can't sit inside H. So the first step is to show that this finite subgroup cannot have either a translation or a glide reflection. And the reason is that if there is such a T, then T, T squared, T cubed are all distinct elements of H, and then H will have infinitely many elements, and so I'll get a contradiction. Step 2, so now in H, you don't have any glide reflections and you don't have any translations. Step 2 is you can show using this that H cannot have two reflections whose lines of reflection are parallel. Because what happens is if you have two such reflections, R and S, then you can easily check that if you compose one after the other, you will get a translation. And a translation has infinite order. And by closure in the subgroup, this RS will also belong to H and we can't have it. Okay, so what you see, what therefore you have is if you have two reflections in H, then their lines of reflection cannot be parallel to each other, they must intersect at a point. Okay, so any two reflections in H have to intersect, right? So if next is we show that if H has two distinct reflections, then it has also a rotation whose center of rotation is the common point of intersection of these two lines. And in fact, that will turn out to be the common point of intersection of all the lines of reflection of reflection symmetry that are there in H. Okay, this is I mean, it takes a little bit of effort to show this step. But now remember what you have. H is a finite set of symmetries, which is a subgroup. It can't have translations. It can't have glide reflections. If there is more than one reflection in it, all the reflections intersect at a single point, which is called P. And I will definitely have at least one rotation, non-zero rotation, about that point P, which will be an element of H. Okay, so these are the things that we end up showing at the step 3 stage. And at step 4, we show that this point P is in fact a common fixed point. If you notice if you do a reflection, all points on the line of reflection are fixed. If you do a rotation, the center of the rotation is always fixed. So this point P turns out to be the common fixed point, and this is true even if H does not have reflections. You can prove that if H has no reflections, then the rotations that are there in H, there are only finitely many rotations, and they all have to be rotations about a common central point, which we call P. And so now our task is to show that this H is either a Cn or a Dn. So for both, you anyway have to find the row. Okay. So you choose the rotation. You have only finite number of rotations in H. Choose the rotation which has the smallest positive degree. Of course, if there is no rotation of smallest positive degree, then you can show that the only element in H is identity. Right? Because if there is a reflection in H, well, okay, if there is only one reflection in H, then you can have just that reflection and identity. Or you can have just identity, but if you have at least two reflections in H, then you will also have non-identity rotations. Okay? So anyway, if there are non-identity rotations, we choose the one with the smallest positive order. it will have finite order, obviously, because if it has infinite order, H will become infinite. So let's call its order n. Then you can show that all the rotations in H are just powers of rho. That is, it will be 1 rho square up to rho to the power n minus 1. Then if H has no reflections at all, then you've already got your group, which is Cn. However, if H has reflection, then you can show that, say, sigma, then you can show that H is generated by rho and sigma. And you remember the presentation I showed you for Dn, you can show that all that is satisfied. So your H just becomes Dn. So this is a very nice result that you have, that it classifies all the finite subgroups of the groups of the planar group, a group of symmetries of the plane, and they are just Dn and Cn. Okay, but how does this tie in with the kinds of questions that you can ask at the research level? So I mentioned in the abstract that I would talk about determination, classification, and enumeration. So determination basically means, so suppose I ask this question, I want to determine all the groups of order 6. That is, all the groups which have 6 elements in them. Then by determination, what I mean is I want to write down a list, and that list is, no two elements in the list are isomorphic to each other. So they're not essentially the same group. And every group of order 6 must be 1 in that list. And if you know a little bit of group theory, you will know that this list, when I determine it, has only 2 elements in it. In fact, we have encountered them already. It's either C3, C6 or it is D3. Okay, these are the only 2 groups which are of order 6 up to isomorphism. All right, so I've determined all the groups of order 6. Now, what is classification? Now, classification is a way in which, so you remember I told you we've classified all the subgroups, all the finite subgroups of the groups of motion. Okay, so what I've managed to show there, in fact, I've also determined them. But classification, generally, I may not put out the list explicitly as I do in a determination problem, but I might actually classify them by their properties. So I might say that there is exactly one abelian group of order 6, and there is exactly one abelian non-abelian group of order 6. And it looks like this. And the abelian group of order 6 is in fact cyclic and looks like this. So that kind of thing turns out to be classification. And what is enumeration? Enumeration is I want to count the number of groups of a given order up to isomorphism. So how many groups are there of order 6 up to isomorphism? The answer is 2. Here, because the order was small, I could actually list out the 2 groups, I could list out all its properties, and I could count it. But in general, if I ask the question, how many groups are there of order 1, 2, 0, 4? I don't know. Can I determine all the groups of order 1, 2, 1, 0, 2, 4? I don't know. Can I classify all the groups of order 1, 0, 2, 4? I don't know. I'm just saying I don't know because I actually don't know right now. But these are things which have been done in using a group algorithmic programming called GAP. Okay, but even GAP does not have the answers for groups of higher orders. Okay, but we have some answers when we want to enumerate groups of large orders. So then what we do is we try and find the bound. We are not able to find exact numbers, but we can say that the number of groups of order p to the power n is at most p to the power 2 by 27th n cubed. Okay, so we are able to say things like that. So there's a whole area of group theory where research is being done on how do you determine groups according to a certain property or something that you're interested in. Say maybe you're interested in groups whose orders are cube free. That means p cube doesn't divide it for any prime p. So can you determine all groups of order which are cube free? Can I classify all groups of order which are cube free? If I'm given an n which is cube free, can I find a bound for the number of groups of order n? Enumeration question. So these are all fairly easy questions to ask, but are very, very difficult to solve. And I would recommend a book by Marcus du Sautoy, which is on symmetry. And I've pulled out a few excerpts on symmetry. This is a popular book, by the way. So he's writing this for a lay audience and not just a mathematician. And this is how he comes to the research questions in maths expressed in layperson's language. These are also about determination, classification, finding things which have these properties and so on. So he's asking what are the different mathematical objects that we have which have exactly 3 into 3 into 3 into 3, 5 times those many symmetries. Such an object has symmetries which are built from piecing together symmetries of 5 triangles, he's saying. What happens if I change from triangles to pentagons and heptagons? There are infinitely many prime numbers and hence infinitely many prime-sided building blocks. What is the nature of all the different shapes that I can construct whose symmetries are built from copies of one prime-sided shape? In particular, if P represents any prime number, how many different objects are there which have P to the power 5 symmetries? How do the symmetrical objects change as I vary the prime? Do they change? Do they vary wildly as I move from one prime to the other? Or are there connections between the objects with, 41 to the power 5 symmetries and objects with 73 to the power 5 symmetry? What happens when I increase the prime-sided shapes? That is, instead of taking 41 to the power 5 symmetries, if I want to look for 41 to the power 7 symmetries, then what happens to the objects which will have those many symmetries? How do they change? And so on. So this is, again, just in layperson's language, these are all questions which have not really been answered. And so just from symmetry, which is a topic which students these days study in 5th, 6th standard by looking at symmetry of shapes and so on, can actually lead to group theory and can take you from to research questions in group theory. So I hope I've convinced you that symmetry and groups are very, very closely related. And these are some of the references. I would also recommend a talk by Professor Martin Ritson of University of Oxford. It's available in their YouTube link and it's on symmetries. It's a public lecture. So he's talking to people who probably do not have a high level of mathematics, and it's on symmetry, and he's asking a different question. You remember the presentation I gave to you of Dn? So he's saying, given certain presentations, can you identify the object whose group of symmetries that might be? Okay? So he's talking about things like that. Then he goes into decision problems in groups and so on. So it's a very interesting talk. I would recommend it. I'll stop here. I've certainly gone on for more than 1 hour, but there were questions in between, so I'm excused.
Thank you, Professor Venkataraman, for the very interesting talk. So I think so we have a few questions, and which I'll let you know. So yeah, so I'll begin with so Saurav Gogoi has a few questions. It seems that Dn is a subgroup of Sn. In general, how many Dn are there in Sn?
So what's his question is, how many Dn's are there in Sn?
Yes, so I guess what he means, how many copies of Dn?
I've actually not thought about this in quite the same way, right? I mean, basically, what you see is Dn is coming, the way you can see Dn sitting inside Sn. Sn is just the bijective functions on n objects, right? So when you look at the regular n-gon, then you have n vertices which get permuted amongst themselves whenever you have a symmetry. So when n is 3, of course D3 and S3 are the same. So there's just one copy of D3 inside S3. When you go to the next level, say 4, you actually see that D4 is different from S4. D4 has order 8 and S4 has order 24. Okay? And the point is that when you're looking at D4, you have to see how is it constructed. So it's constructed using a rotation of degree 4 and a reflection of order 2, such that when you conjugate that rotation by the reflection, you get the rotation inverse. Okay, so if you want to see how many copies of D4 you have in S4, you really need to see how many such pairs of rotations and reflections that you can pull out, which will create it. But another way, which is which I can kind of answer immediately, is that if you look at a group of order 24, its order is 8 into 3, right? So any subgroup of order 8 is what is called a Sylow 2 subgroup of the group. And we know that all Sylow 2 subgroups are conjugate, and we also know exactly how many of these are there. So in a group of, in S4, which is a group of order 24, we'll have 3 Sylow 2 subgroups. Okay, that means there are 3 copies of D4 sitting inside S4. Now, if you ask me about S5, it becomes more difficult. Okay, because when I'm looking at S5, then I'm counting how many subgroups of order 10 it has, which are going to look like, I mean, of course, they all look like D5 if they're non-abelian. So the question then becomes how many groups of order, so in S5, the question really becomes how many subgroups of order 10 can I have? And again, the key is to look at how these subgroups of order 10 are generated. And if you have a sense of how you can do that, you can possibly do this calculation. But offhand, I cannot think of a formula which will tell me how many copies of Dn are sitting inside Sn.
So there's a question by Deependra Nath. So I'm just rephrasing it. So he asks, so D8 is represents the symmetry of the octagon, and it is given a 2-dimensional polygon. It's easy to find. So I guess he means, so if you have, so the dihedral group corresponds to the regular polygons. Is it possible to find what higher dimensional figures are
Yes,
also have these symmetric groups?
Yeah, so for the equivalent of the regular n-gons when you're in 3 dimension is the 5 platonic solids. So you have the tetrahedron, the cube, the octahedron, the dodecahedron, and the icosahedron. And out of these, the cube and the octahedron are what are called duals of each other. Tetrahedron is self-dual, and the icosahedron and the dodecahedron are duals of each other. Basically, you get the dual by taking the midpoints of the faces of one of these objects and joining them. And so inside a cube, you can find an octahedron. Inside an octahedron, you can find a cube and so on. And if you think a little bit about it, then you'll see that the symmetries of the cube are going to be exactly the same as the symmetries of a octahedron. And similarly, the symmetries of a icosahedron and the symmetries of a dodecahedron are the same. And these are well understood. So you actually know which groups occur as the group of rotations of these platonic solids. You know what their full symmetry group looks like. And I'm not going to reveal the answers here. A nice way, which is what I did, as a graduate student, I had to tutor undergraduates who were learning about symmetries of platonic solids when I was studying at Oxford. And I had never done them quite in the same way before. So I built myself a dodecahedron and used a pencil to poke through it to figure out the rotations and the angles and so on. And it's good fun. So I don't want to tell you the answer, but you can find the answers in almost any standard textbook in group theory or algebra. So they're all there. But the fun is in discovering it yourself. So you know that they're basically reflections and rotations. So try and see if you can find all of them. Start with the cube, because that's something that you're very familiar with. And try and identify the rotations first. Then you'll be able to get to the others. And of course, you can talk about this in higher dimensions. I mean, but whether you have all groups. So in a more general way, you can ask the question that the one that we are talking about, the finite subgroups of the group of planar symmetries have been classified. So what about the finite subgroups of the group of planar symmetries of a three-dimensional space of R cubed? Similarly, you can go into the higher dimensions, but you'll already see that pretty much the fact that you have a regular n-gon for any n and then you're coming down to 5 platonic solids, that kind of thing is something that you will find happens the more you I'm assuming. I've also not really thought about this question in any great depth.
So the next question is by Bijeta. So Paul, who asks, how does the symmetry of odd sides and even sides differ in a dihedral group? Can you elaborate?
She means when n is odd and n is even,
yes.
right? So maybe I should just draw and show this. Just give me a second. I'll just share the screen. Oops. Where's my Zoom meeting? Yeah, here. Share screen. Yeah. Okay, so let me draw a hexagon. Oops, as I said, I'm really bad at drawing straight lines. So here's what passes for a hexagon. Okay, so this is supposed to be a regular hexagon. So here I have 6 sides. So 3 pairs of opposite sides. So these will be 3 lines of reflections that I can get. So if n is even, then I have n by 2 lines of reflection by joining midpoints of opposite sides. But I can also join the diagonals. Okay. So I've already joined one diagonal. This was the second, and this is the third diagonal I have. So I have n by 2 lines. This is opposite sides, midpoint. And these are n by 2 lines which are diagonals. Okay. And so this is when I have an even-sided thing. So let's now examine what happens if I'm looking at a pentagon. Okay, so this is supposed to be a regular pentagon. And I have 5 sides here, right? So obviously I can't go, there's nothing like an opposite side in that sense. Okay, but what happens here is, and there is nothing like a diagonal either. So what you do is the vertex and the opposite, midpoint of opposite side. So from every vertex, draw a line to the midpoint of the opposite side. and you'll get your 5 lines of reflection. So here when n is odd, your line of reflection is from vertex to midpoint of opposite side. It's the same as in a triangle, equilateral triangle. Okay, so I hope this answers her query.
So, Professor Anupam Saikia from IIT Guwahati commented in the Facebook live stream, I am listening to her lecture after many years. Thanks to Gonit Sora.
Yeah, I'm truly happy that I have Anupam again listening to my lecture. So, I mean, it's an honor for me. I mean, he's done so well, and I'm so glad to have him listen to me.
So one final question which has been put forward by several participants. So it's, how is symmetry used in everyday life? What are real life applications of today's topic?
Okay, I'm going to actually give you one little story about this, which I personally found extremely interesting because it combined group symmetry and differential equations. And you know, it had to do with how horses run, of all things. So it looked at what is called the gait of horses. So when horses trot or they run, there's a particular way in which their legs move. Okay, and so this is a mathematician who works in applied kind of area in the US. I'm really sorry, I'm not being, I think it's Marty Golubutsky, if I'm not mistaken. But we heard a talk by him when I was still teaching in Stephens. And it was a really interesting talk because he'd used differential equations to model how the movement of horses or something like that. And it turned out that he had also looked at how horses were running and trotting and so on, and from that got information. But when he then explored certain symmetries which were happening, and maybe it was symmetries related to the solution space of the differential equations, he found that a certain way in which a horse runs, which he had not found out actually by looking at horses, he was able to find looking at the maths. And then he went back to the field and verified that, aise bhi daudte hain horses. So this is just a very, I mean, it's not directly related to that. But symmetry is something that's being used a huge amount in development of drugs and molecules and so on and so forth. So when you look at polymers and isomers and so on, some of the, you already know that they exist in nature in a particular formation. But then by exploring their symmetries, you can also see what are the other forms in which they may exist. And some of them may not appear directly in nature, right? But through symmetry, you explore that these other possibilities exist. And remember that when they appear in a different symmetry, by symmetry, it's reaching another configuration, but that configuration determines its physical and chemical properties sometimes. So you might get a very different property in the manner in which that the molecules or the atoms in that compound exist. You know, they're the way in which they knit together and exist. So again, symmetry plays a role there. Of course, group theory, which in a way has emerged from, is the study of symmetry, that has huge number of applications. And it's also at the level of applications difficult to separate group theory and sometimes number theory and so on. So the number theorists will say Fermat's little theorem and its generalization are number theory results. The group theory people will say that it's just a simple result in group theory. And cryptography now, a lot of it is emerging out of things like Fermat's little theorem, or you're looking at the rational points which form a group on elliptic curves. And I think the talk that Anupam gave in Ganitsora some time ago, he talked about elliptic curves and how and he looked at the rational points and you could do a nice addition on them. And so elliptic curves and the groups associated with them are playing a role in cryptography now. Cyclic groups are being used, braid groups are being used. So cryptography, coding, I mean, all sorts of areas in which these things are playing a role.
So thank you very much for your very interesting talk. Thank you for giving us your time. And I think we will stop the live recording now.
Thanks so much. It was my pleasure. I really, really enjoyed this, and particularly the interaction. Thanks.